This is the concluding part of the first day of the Data Spaces Symposium. So we have had the 4 parallel tracks of the DSBA partners so far. And now we convene here to see that we are really converging our ideas, our visions, and then we will hand over to the other days, tomorrow and the day after. I'm Lars Nagel, CEO of International Data Spaces Association, and I can say we already had a great day. A lot of insights, a lot of cool people here. And I'm super happy to announce the first keynote speaker in the plenary. Today it's Ulrich Homann from Microsoft. So he's Corporate Vice President for Cloud and AI and Distinguished Architect for Azure Engineering. He really knows how to build data spaces, and Microsoft has been active in the last years in our ecosystem. And, well, he's also responsible for the industry partners of Microsoft and the most innovative project. So I'm really interested to learn more about that. Maybe you also know him from YouTube, the Armchair Architects. So this will be very entertaining. And without further ado, I hand over to you, Uli. Entertain us. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Lars. Very much appreciated. Thank you guys for hanging in. I know that it's dark. It's already kind of late. You have been talking about data spaces all day. So I will try and entertain you a little bit. But obviously, this is a serious topic. Lars kind of said we have been engaged since a couple of years. Well, I would say that when I got asked by the legal team to look into Gaia-X 3.5 years ago, I kind of looked at it, and while there were lots of great ideas in there, there was one idea that came up as the key: data and the focus on data. And the international data spaces idea that was described there, I said, you know what? Fine, let's go focus on add more value to the Gaia-X conversation as much as we can, but really focus on that data space, because data is the new oil, as some people keep saying. And thinking through how you make that data available is something that we care about deeply. As part of this work, I kicked off actually the engineering work that led to the Eclipse data space components and to the Eclipse data space workspaces that we are driving now together with the rest of this incredible community that we have been building up. So the idea is, how do we go and make sure that the data that you produce, the data that you own, the data that you want to make to money or share for good, or whatever the scenario is that you're driving, how can you do that in a way that's trusted, meaning you own the data, you validate that the trust is verified, and you own the goals and the policies that protect those goals of how that data is being shared. And do it in a way that does not require you to work with Microsoft or Snowflake or AWS or Google or any of these guys in a direct fashion, but you can do it with any of those partners and more. Create an open ecosystem that allows us to really share this data and make the data that all of these enterprises, all of the machine builders, all of the industry automation, everybody has into the next internet. How do we go and build the internet of data? That's really what ultimately this is all about. And if you look at the participants that are really going after this opportunity, you see a lot of important names and interesting names. Next year, if we come together again here, I would love to see potentially your names or my friends from Japan or other places to effectively go and be the scenarios that we talk about. I'm sure you have heard all about Catena-X, the European automotive supply chain network, and the scenarios that they care about. And that's a large scenario. But there are also smaller scenarios. So, for example, the VDMA has been thinking about how do I go and help my machine builders, people like Trumpf or DMG Mori or other places that effectively build all these great assets that produce tons of data, very valuable data. How do I enable them to share the data inside the factory in a way that allows the owner and operator of the factory to gain value, but on equal terms? how do I go and make sure that the value that is generated is actually monetizable? If you monetize it or not is a different conversation. That's between you and the user of the machine, but you should be able to monetize. And I think that's a really interesting, very different idea than Catena-X. Catena-X has a centralized clearinghouse, a centralized operator, everybody participates. In this case, this would be a peer-to-peer conversation. How do I go and create this machine that automatically shares data, but in a controlled, managed, and policy-driven fashion? I learned about another fascinating scenario this afternoon. Gaia-X is effectively about travel data and tourism. The Paris Olympics is actually using data spaces and Gaia-X today, or actually when the Olympics will start, to effectively manage the travel of the athletes and their delegates from the beginning of their journey, meaning landing in Paris-Charles de Gaulle, and all the way into their homes, wherever they are staying for the Olympics. And all of that requires immense coordination and effectively tons of data. So Gaia-X is using the data space capabilities to effectively make that possible. And of course, there's lots and lots and lots of other scenarios. And now you think about, okay, how do we think about this problem? The value proposition that we are seeing is effectively that data is valuable. Everybody says so. Now with generative AI being the latest capability that we're talking about, it's even more important. We're saying that that's your differentiation. But most companies actually have the data inactive. They lie in some data lakes, then data warehouses, data spaces, not in our spaces, but in places where effectively data is at home, and nobody uses it. And part of this is because we are afraid of sharing the data. We are afraid that somebody will take advantage of the data without having us participate in the value creation and, of course, the monetization. And so we want to figure out how we effectively go help them to unlock all this wonderful data. The data space capability, because it is open, it is standardized, and anybody who wants to play can play, creates that model of trust that will enable us to figure out a way to really create this sharing opportunity for everybody. Without those attributes, you can't share. Peter, my friend here that works with me, had a great comparison. He said, you know what? When the internet got built, there were predecessors to the internet. Anybody remember Gopher? I do. Yeah, I'm old enough, yes. We share gray hair somewhere. And the idea is that Gopher was actually not bad. It was a pretty interesting protocol set and so forth, but it wasn't widespread, it wasn't really open, and it wasn't adopted. Microsoft had a proprietary internet effectively we were building a complete worldwide network, proprietary protocols, tools, everything. And this would have been a great business opportunity, but it would have never led to the thing that we call the internet today, ever. Because closed protocols can never create the opportunity that you create when everybody can play. Then you actually have to not compete on proprietary tech, but on ideas, on implementation, on scalability, on strength of compliance, on other trust attributes that effectively make your partners want to give data to you. And that, I think, is going to be something that we keep on having to repeat for ourselves on how we think about this. The other piece, obviously, and the EU Data Act is going to formalize a lot of this, is how do we govern the data? So you guys all remember the Meta case, or Facebook case, with our analytics friends in the UK, where they effectively disobeyed the rules that Facebook actually did set up. Facebook does have rules. Even if you don't believe it, they do, in terms of what you can do with the data. But the guys in the UK just ignored it. So now part of what we're trying to figure out here together as part of the data space work is how do I go and give you data or access to my data and tell you what the rules are for that data, what you can do with that data, how you can use it, and so forth. Coming back to that AI case, remember, this is getting to get even more important. Can I use AI to train my large language model? Is that, my data to train my large language model, is that okay? For what purposes? And stuff like that. So I think we need to go and think about data, not as a, oh my God, I want to hide it, but as something that here is my data, but here are the rules associated with my data. Here's the policy that I will push with my data. And if it's really sensitive data, we might need to inject technologies like confidential compute scenarios to effectively go and make sure that the data cannot be tampered with outside of the usage patterns that you actually have put out as policies. So that's really the value proposition. Don't think about data as something that you should hide, something that you effectively don't share with anybody, because if you don't share it, it's useless. I know of a customer, and I won't even know the industry because some of you might say, I have heard about this one. So I won't tell you where or which customer it is or what industry, but they are collecting data from their machines in their plants and factories. They're collecting so much data that they currently have 2 exabytes, exabytes of data that nobody ever looks at. Nobody knows what that data does, what it's used for, but they keep collecting it because that's what they've always done. And the only person that is very happy is the license provider for the system that manages the software, the data, and whoever the storage partner is. Those guys are super happy because there is absolutely nothing that's going to happen. They will keep collecting and no value is being produced. And I think all of you will look into your businesses and say, I know one of those systems where there's lots of data that's being collected, but nobody knows what the hell that data is, what it's used for, but let's keep collecting it. And I think data spaces give you an opportunity to turn this opportunity around and say, hey, what data do I have where I could add value? And sometimes the value is monetary, ideally, hopefully, but sometimes it's also societal. If you have data that is focused for an ESG data, and we can make a contribution, wouldn't you feel free to say, hey, if somebody is creating analytics that help me reduce my footprint or reduce the footprint of my society, I think we should all be saying, I'm happy to give you my data so that you can go and do interesting things with this. So think of data as something that you want to have actively used, actively out there, rather than hidden in some database or some Excel file that nobody ever sees and use outside of 2 or 3 people inside your organization. Now, some of you will know all this, but let's go through it in any case so that everybody's on the same page. What is this data space that we're talking about? First of all, a data space is all about metadata. Who are you? What data are you sharing? What are the rules that you're sharing? And that data, that metadata is effectively shared with other folks that are participating in that data space. One of the misconceptions that I want to clarify, a data space does not have to have a central authority where everything hangs out. It is a peer-to-peer model as much as it is a hub-and-spoke model. You can implement either, and it will work just fine. And always remember, data spaces are all about participants, and sometimes the participants might be global, sometimes they might be very local, and that's perfectly fine. And that's, I think, another power of the data spaces that I don't see in a lot of other technologies. Participants in the data space effectively negotiate data contracts. They say, here's the data that I have, here's what the data means, because that's also sometimes really important. And then, what is the contract and usage policies? Who can access it? What can you use it for? And so forth. Data spaces don't care about the infrastructure. If it runs on Microsoft Azure, if it runs on AWS, GCP, or on your infrastructure, on a Siemens whatever system, it doesn't care. It's like the saltwater crocodiles. I always love that when the Australians talk about their crocodiles, they love that. The saltwater crocodile effectively does not care if it's in salt water and sweet water. It just is a crocodile and will eat you if you go swim. So be careful. Policies control the access. That's very important. And part of the beauty of the data space is that they have created a policy language. So you can now express policy as something that you want to effectively guard and govern your data. This data spaces people are also smart where they stay out of the policy business. In terms of what are those policies that govern data spaces is something that either domain-specific folks should think about or the individual companies that work together to share data. Because they should say, how does this data work like? And the data owner should effectively say, yes, I opt into these policies, or here are my policies, and live or die with them. Data transfer is always peer-to-peer, because there's a lot of technology out there that already helps you move data around. And I think that's another really nice attribute of the Fraunhofer investments in data spaces and now the international data spaces, that the team effectively thought about, what do we not do? What can existing technology already help me with? I have HTTP, I have FTP, I have Kafka, I have God knows what technology that are able to move data. None of these technology, however, know how to manage participation, how to manage semantics, and how to manage policy. So those are three elements that effectively are the core of what the data spaces really worry about. And then there's tons of business opportunity. Data, as we know it, will effectively create new opportunities, very much like the internet. Remember, 1995, the internet really literally comes out like Phoenix out of the ashes kind of thing. And all of a sudden, you see 3 years later, Amazon gets launched. Nobody knew what online commerce was. Nobody thought about how to do that kind of stuff. And all of a sudden, any of you can imagine life without Amazon? Or, dare I say it, Google, a Google search engine? That's effectively a brand new business. I don't know how big Google is these days, but it's a large, large business. So think about the opportunity, think internet and data. Now we are at the dawn of 1995, maybe 94, because we're still early. But now in 95 we come out, and who is going to be the next Amazon, the next Google, the next Facebook that effectively says, how can I leverage this data and the technology to grow my business to this point? Is the opportunity be this big? I hope so, I think so, but we will see. And I hope that a bunch of these people that are in this room will be those guys that come up with ideas of how to do this. And one of the things I beg of you is step back. I don't know if you have read Jeff Bezos' book, where he talks about how he came up with this idea. He simply said, I had no idea what to do. I just knew that this thing was big. And so he went and thought, and then he said, you know what? I'm going to become an e-commerce platform, and I'm going to start with books. Again, read the book. It's very interesting in terms of how he came up with this idea, because a lot of times I see companies fall into the trap, Microsoft be one company, that effectively said, you know what? This internet is important. Bill Gates wrote a great memo about it, the Internet Tidal Wave, 1995. So finally, Microsoft wakes up and embraces the internet. Great. But we stood there and said, you know what? How do I put the internet into Excel, into Word, into Windows, into God knows what the product was at the time? But nobody at Microsoft said, how do I go and build e-commerce, build search, build social? Because we were all thinking in our products. So do yourself a favor and at least have some of your folks go wild. What does this data and data space opportunity allow us to do that goes beyond what we do today? And I think that's a real interesting opportunity to think about. Now, when you think about the big thing that's happening right now in the industry, anybody who has not lived under a rock for the last 14 months knows what ChatGPT is and what generative AI is. It's obviously the next opportunity for data to shine. And here's just some examples of the characteristics that I walked you through that effectively allow us to talk about how do we go and effectively govern the usage of data, my data, your data, in the AI systems. Despite what some people think, the internet effectively already has data sharing policies. So if you have a website that has content, you can actually control what the web crawlers are allowed to do. You can control what content they can effectively search for. It's not as good as the data space policy approach, but it is actually possible. And most people that now say, wait a second, how did AI get access to my data, didn't really understand how to control their content and manage the policies that the crawlers use. So the same is to be said if you think about data spaces and structured data, unstructured data. Think about those machine builders, the Trumps and the DMG Moris and others. How do they go and share the data in a way that other people can make AI usage of it, but the machine builder effectively gets benefit from it? And I'm not going to read the slide, but this is how you have to think about it. Who has access to it? What is the usage policies? And what does the contract look like? And do this for every data set that you want to share. You can, of course, create a single data space with lots of data in it, but you can also do it data set by data set, which is another really nice way of thinking about it, so that you can go and say, yes, this data I'm cool with to give to a public entity that is doing good. This one here, I'm only going to give to my customers that are paying me for it. This one here, I'm only keeping to myself. And maybe there's internal data sharing between organizational parts where you say, actually, yes, I'm willing to share with my team, but only under these rules. So data sharing is not just between companies, it's also within organizations, so that effectively you know exactly what data goes where. I personally believe that the regulator will become even harder on us in terms of where did this data originate? What does this data mean? Who produces it? How did it get transformed? All of these things. And who used it to effectively add value? And I believe that the data spaces opportunity allows us to think about this ahead of the regulator, with the regulator, so that we can go and drive it from there. Now, standards are the only way to make this happen. Data sharing is happening all over the place, by the way. We are doing this forever. FTP is one of the big data sharing technologies. But obviously, we have an opportunity to drive this further. Think internet data space. Let's make this happen is our mantra. And part of this is, how do we standardize this? So now we are seeing that the international organizations that drive standards are getting really interested. So there's work going on in ISO, in CN, in CWA, and other things, where you effectively can go and say, yes, now we are driving the standard. Then there are technical standards, because the standard that ISO worries about are words. Words are awesome. Unfortunately, English is a very flexible language, and so you need to think through how you implement it. So part of what we have done as a team have created an open source implementation in this Eclipse Data Space Working Group, where we effectively come up with protocol implementation that implement the standards driven by ISO, and effectively say, here's how you speak data space. So this is effectively a language. And then the last piece is code that implements that language, so that people can just say, I can start with an open source implementation, again, under the governance of Eclipse and other spaces, so that you can say, now I'm going to implement a data space. So if I'm looking at Mr. Hare here from the VDMA, his developers, his machine builders don't have to start from scratch. They can implement the protocol without any usage of open source, but there's an open source capability, for example, the Eclipse data space components, that get you a head start of how to speak data space. And I think that's something that we should be grateful for, because other companies have implemented this. They have put resources in to make this happen. Microsoft is one of them, BMW, lots of other folks, SAP, that have participated. And now it's up to you to use it, but also give back. So participate in open source projects, participate in the data space opportunity, become a member of IDSA, and so forth. And this is something that we believe is really important. The more voices we have, the better off we are. We need focused people that want to implement things, but we also need people that have different perspective, so that the data space truly becomes the internet of the next generation. And I think we have that opportunity, and you are the people that can make this happen. With that, I'm being told, get off the stage, you are boring. And effectively will leave you to the next person who is going to go up in space and is getting really excited. So thank you very, very much for hanging in here and listening. Appreciate you. Thank you.